Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our attendees joining us today for this latest Data Science Central webinar. This is Bill Vorhies, your host. I'm the Editorial Director with Data Science Central and also Chief Data Scientist for Data Magnum. Now, I'd like to start off our event today by thanking Tableau for sponsoring today's event. Tableau is a longtime supporter of the Data Science Central community, and we're honored to have them sponsoring our event today. Now, past webinars are available on demand at datasciencecentral.com, and if you haven't had the opportunity to view them, I encourage you to take a look. They provide some very useful insight into a wide variety of topics of interest to our data science community. Now, today's webinar is entitled Dashboard Design with the User in Mind, and that'll be presented by Tableau. But before we begin, I'd like to briefly review the format of today's webinar. Today's event will be an hour long. We'll have one presenter who I'll introduce in just a minute. There'll be 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A following the presentation, and this event is being recorded and will be available on datasciencecentral.com later this afternoon following today's live event. Now, I'd also like to encourage our attendees to provide questions throughout the presentation, as we'll be reviewing and presenting them on your behalf during the Q&A portion of today's event. Well, I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Alyshia Olsen with Tableau. Alyshia is a user experience designer at Tableau on the developer platform team, shipping the new Extensions API and the Tableau Extensions Gallery. She previously worked on the data access, formatting, and visualization teams. Now, prior to Tableau, Alyshia worked at Microsoft as a program manager, and in addition to her professional work in user experience, she enjoys cross-discipline work and creates new fonts, applications, and artwork. She holds a BS in engineering with a concentration in design from Olin. So, Alyshia, thank you for being with us today. We're looking forward to your presentation. Now, in today's Data Science Central webinar, you'll learn how to apply user experience design principles to your dashboard creation process. Alyshia Olsen, a user experience designer at Tableau, will walk you through a proven process for understanding and predicting potential demands on a given dashboard and how to proactively build and prioritize for a variety of variables. Now, today's webinar will include several practice examples. You'll see how to build dashboards that are more effective and appropriate for audience that they're intended for by anticipating the user's needs. So, Alyshia, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. You can begin as soon as you're ready to go.
Hi, thank you, Bill, for that great introduction, and thank you, everyone, for being here today. As Bill mentioned, I am a user experience designer here at Tableau, and I want to start off by asking you to think about some Tableau dashboards or any data visualizations that you've used in the past. Specifically, think about any of them that have made you feel confused, lost, or frustrated. I have some good news for you. That frustration was not your fault. It was the dashboard designer's fault. Now, maybe you weren't the intended audience for that dashboard, but maybe you were. And maybe the dashboard designer didn't really know what you needed to get out of that dashboard. Over the next hour, I'm going to talk about how to apply design thinking to your dashboard creation process so that you don't make dashboards that make other people feel confused. Before we dive in, I'm going to touch on a key aspect of user experience design, or UX design. UX design is about anticipating your user's needs. And actually, a lot of this is about psychology. It's about learning how other people think, figuring out how they approach problems they're trying to solve, and giving them what they need before they know they need it. One of the awesome things about user experience design is that the skill set isn't just a trade. It can be applied to almost anything. And design can be a fuzzy process, but the cost of not considering your users can be really high. Even if you build a dashboard that's not confusing or frustrating, something that's really well designed, it might be answering the wrong questions, questions that your users don't actually need the answers to. Today, I'm going to walk you through the design process. This is something that UX designers use to put structure around the process of getting to know your users and then designing the right solutions for them. It'll help you put rails on your process so that you create solutions that give your users what they need and ultimately save them time and money. There are 4 basic parts of this process that designers usually use to frame their work. First, we have the discover phase. During this part of the process, we're going to be gathering a lot of information from our users and looking into what they want to get out of this dashboard and why. It's important not to limit yourself here and let the conversations go in any direction. We don't want to let our assumptions about what we think our users need bias us while we're talking to them. Once we've started to empathize with and understand our users, we move on to the distill phase. During this part of the process, we're looking for patterns in our notes, connecting the dots, and developing a better understanding of those users that we talked to in the discovery phase. At the end of the distill phase, we should have a pretty good understanding of the main goals of the dashboard. Next, we have the ideate phase. Here it's important to try not to pass judgment on our ideas just yet. Build on them instead, and be creative about how you want to enable your users' success. Once we have a number of possible solutions, we use the validate phase to discover which of these solutions are most appropriate for our users and which ones need to go back to the drawing board. A great way to think about these 4 phases is that the first 2 were about making sure that we're solving the right problem. If we skip discovery and distill, we might make that fantastic dashboard that gets at the wrong questions. The next 2 phases are about solving the problem the right way. So once we know what our users need, let's make sure that all the visualizations that we're creating and the interactions and the layout of our data make sense to them so that they can answer the questions that they need to. Now, I've mentioned our users a couple of times, and I want to make sure that we know who our user is. How do we know who's using the dashboard? And I'm going to tell you a story. This is my dad. And as you can probably tell from the picture next to him, he's a mechanic, and he's a pretty organized one at that. A couple of years ago, my dad decided that he was finally going to get an iPhone. I was really proud of him. One thing he settled on pretty quickly was that he was definitely going to get a case with this iPhone because he wanted to make sure that it was protected in the shop. And I bet you all know what kind of case he got. He went for the OtterBox. So just knowing those few things about my dad, we can deduce what kind of case was probably best for him. And I definitely made fun of him for this decision because he didn't just get any OtterBox, he got the biggest, bulkiest OtterBox he could possibly find. This picture here is actually the same model case that he originally got when he first got a phone. And honestly, in my opinion, why would you do this to your iPhone? It's such a beautiful piece of hardware, and the OtterBox makes it harder to use. But my dad didn't care. He loved the OtterBox. And his dedication to it was only strengthened when he lost his phone a couple months later in September. My dad called me about a week later and told me he'd found the phone in the backyard while he was mowing the lawn. And my parents live in Florida, and are known for getting a lot of rain there this time of year. I immediately interrupted him to offer up one of my old iPhones because I knew how much he loved that new phone he had gotten, but he laughed at me and told me I didn't let him finish. The phone still works, not a drop of water damage. OtterBox has a customer for life. Now, there are a lot of different iPhone cases on the market, and this picture just shows a subset of them. But most of these are going to be terrible cases for my dad, not because they're inherently bad iPhone cases, just because they're not made for my dad, just like the OtterBox case my dad has wasn't really made for me. So I made a mistake when I was talking to my dad about that iPhone case. I assumed incorrectly that since I was also an iPhone user, I was a representative user. But I'm not. My dad and I are very different people, even though we both use iPhones. The story illustrates how important it is to know who you're designing for and know what their goals are. Now, there's another type of person who you may have run into before that seems like they're a user, but they're not. They're pretty uppity, they're not totally in touch with the people who are doing most of the work, and they think they're more important than they actually are. Hippo stands for a highly paid person's opinion. Most of the time, these opinions are going to be coming from upper-level managers, people who want the dashboard to be created, and they actually do have a vested interest in it, but they're not the people who are going to be using and looking at the dashboard day in and day out. They might have a lot of opinions about what they think needs to go in it, and you might actually have to appease them and meet some of those requirements they have for you. But it's really important to remember when you're talking to these people that they are customers. They're not your user. Your user is the person who is going to be using that dashboard more than anyone else. So you need to make sure you're talking to your users as well. All right, let's get back to those 4 stages of the design process that I talked about earlier. For the rest of this talk, I'm going to give you a more detailed overview of each phase of the design process. In each phase, I'll leave you with some techniques to to use while you're in that stage, as well as a couple things to keep in mind. First, we have the discover phase. During this phase, our goal is to figure out what our users really need. And our users can be misleading because they're going to try to solve their own problems. They're probably going to tell you what solution they're interested in rather than telling you why they actually want the dashboard. Your job here is to figure out what they really mean when they tell you about a solution they want. One thing to make sure we keep in mind during this phase is to question the obvious. There are no stupid questions during this phase. And what this mantra is going to help us do is question all of our assumptions and break down the ones that are incorrect. The first interviewing method I'm going to walk you through will help you do just that. This technique is called the 5 whys, and it's exactly what it sounds like. We're going to ask why 5 times. The goal here is not to act like an annoying 2-year-old. It's to get you to push yourself beyond the obvious, ask those stupid questions, and really get to the heart of what your users need from you. This interview is one that I conducted with a friend of my dad's. His name is John Massey, and he owns a Toyota dealership. John asked me for a dashboard to help him make some business decisions about his shop. So I'm going to recap this user interview using the 5 whys as an example. Originally, John told me that he needs a dashboard that shows him the year and make of the vehicle coming into his shop over time. When I asked him why he needed to see this information, what he told me was, "That's obvious. I need to see what cars are coming into my shop." Now, I could have stopped here. I could have assumed that I just asked a really stupid question and got on with building that dashboard. It would look something like this. Here, he can see the number of vehicles per model coming into the shop per year, as well as the vehicles per day. He can actually explore this dashboard as well. For example, he can click on a Prius, and the rest of the dashboard will filter to let him see the distribution of Priuses coming into the shop. That's exactly what he asked for. And John would probably have been really happy with this dashboard initially, but it does have a couple problems. First, it's a bit short-sighted because it really optimizes for a single goal, understanding the range of the vehicles coming into the shop. Unfortunately, we still don't know why this was something John wanted information about. Because of that, there's a pretty high likelihood that John will use this for a while and come back asking me for more visualizations he'd like to see, which will interrupt my workflow since I'll have to get reacquainted with the data set. Secondly, I probably know more about creating great visualizations and dashboards than John does, just like John knows a lot more about running an auto shop than I do. Simply creating exactly what he asked me for doesn't fully take advantage of my skill set. So instead, I kept asking John, why? The next thing he told me was that he needed to figure out which parts to keep on hand. And this is really interesting because this is an insight we didn't have before. It's not really about what cars are coming into the shop, it's about the parts he needs to fix them. And what he said was he doesn't want to have these parts on hand because they're expensive, and if he's not going to be going through them, he doesn't want them on hand. There were a couple things that came to mind when he told me this. So just take a moment and think about why he may have wanted to know that information. The first thing that came to my mind was cost. He mentioned that the parts are expensive, and maybe he just doesn't want to have cash tied up in the parts. The other thing was efficiency. If the parts aren't on hand, the vehicles are going to take longer to get fixed. And I could have asked him here, is this more about cost or efficiency? But that's actually a leading question because it doesn't leave room for the answer to be about anything that's not cost or efficiency. Which brings us to another point. Keep your questions open-ended. You don't want to ask questions that make your users choose one of a few options. Doing that will limit the answers that they think they can give you, usually unconsciously. Another piece of advice here is not to ask yes or no questions to your users because they'll probably just say yes or no. You want them to elaborate a little bit on what's going on in their head so that you can understand how their thought process works. So let's get back to that user interview. When I asked John why he wanted to know what parts to keep on hand, he told me that he wants to know when a vehicle is waiting on a part shipment. So it was more about efficiency than cost. And when I probed a little bit further, what he told me was that he wants to understand when a vehicle is not being actively worked on. And parts are one reason that can happen. That's why he thought the shop wasn't as efficient as he wanted it to be. But there were a couple other reasons besides parts. And when I asked why he needed to understand this information, finally, what he told me is that he's looking to eliminate wasted time in his shop. And this is actually really interesting because if you look at the list of questions and list of answers he gave me, the first one, understand the year and make of vehicle over time, is going to create a very different dashboard than one that helps John eliminate wasted time in the shop. And the reason he asked me for this dashboard in the first place was because he wanted to eliminate that wasted time. He just didn't tell me that until I talked to him for about 10 minutes and pushed a little bit on what he wanted to get out of the dashboard. So here's the final dashboard I ended up making him. As you can see, some of the charts that were in the original dashboard are also here. They weren't complete throwaway charts. But I've added 2 more. The one on the right shows vehicles on hold, which means that they're not being actively worked on. And it shows that by category. And those categories are all the different reasons that they could be on hold. The chart on the left shows what's going on with his technicians. How long does it take them to complete a job compared to the estimated time it should take them to complete based on flat rate hour estimates. So from the data, we can see that the technicians in his shop are actually pretty efficient for most job types, even though technician availability is the reason that most vehicles are on hold. All right, I'm going to go through one more technique in the discover phase. And this one is called Contextual Inquiry. Now that's just a fancy design term for follow people around while they do their job and ask them questions. One really important thing to remember during this technique is to come from a place of learning. Sometimes if you follow people around while they're working, consciously or unconsciously, they will think that you're evaluating them, even that you might have the power to fire them if they're not great at their job. So make sure that they know that that's not why you're there and empathize with them about the difficult aspects of their day. I have another example to talk to you about here, and this one involves a design firm called IDEO. And this design firm was asked by a medical device producer to come up with a device that nurses would use to enter data during a very painful procedure that involved putting a needle into the patient's back. And they kind of had something in mind. It was a sweet gadget that looked kind of like an iPad. And they expected the nurses to hold the device in one hand and enter data with the other hand. Well, when the designers talked to the nurses who actually did the procedure, the nurses were totally on board with the concept. And why wouldn't they be? It looks a lot like a device that they were already pretty familiar with. But the designers chose to spend a day watching the nurses during the procedure. And when they did this, they found something really interesting. The first thing that every single nurse did was hold the patient's hand. And when the designers asked the nurses in the moment, "What are you doing?" the nurses said, "Well, this is my job. This is a terrifying procedure. The patient is awake. They're getting a needle inserted into their back. They're scared. Part of my job is to make them feel comfortable." And this is really interesting because the nurses just didn't realize they did this when they were interviewed. It was something that was just so instinctive, such a basic part of their job, that they had no idea it was going to affect the design of the device they had been interviewed about. Here's that device that IDEO ended up designing for those nurses. It's a one-handed device with buttons on the side so that the nurse can continue to hold the patient's hand while entering data. And it doesn't look sleek or sexy, but it does the job well, and that's what's important. So what this shows us here is that we need to pay attention to context. We need to know what context our users are going to be using our dashboards in. Are they going to be on a warehouse floor? Are they going to be running somewhere and needing to use mobile most of the time? Will their goal when using it to be finding specific information quickly, or to really sit with it and explore their data more deeply? Because that's going to affect the basic design of your dashboard. Lastly, I want to touch on one more point. Let people elaborate. Now, you should definitely have a basic script with questions that you know you need to ask before you talk to your users, but the whole point of this phase is to find answers to questions you didn't know you had. So if an interesting thread comes up, that's okay, follow it. Once we've interviewed our users and understand a bit more about what they're going to use this dashboard for and how it will fit into their current workflow, we need to develop our own perspective about what the dashboard's going to do and how it's going to accomplish everything. Because we could just build everything our users have asked for, but oftentimes doing that means we will end up with a dashboard that looks something like this. This workbook has a ton of dashboards and sheets in it, but it's going to have a bit of a learning curve to find what you're looking for, unless you're the person who built it. When you do a couple user interviews but don't have your own perspective at the end of it, you can end up trying to do everything all at once. And while there are places where this could be appropriate, 95% of the time it's not what you want. During the distill phase, remember that our job is to build what our users need, not what they want. I usually start the distill phase with a pile of notes from user interviews that look something like this. All of these are actually notes from one user. During this phase, we're going to take all that information in the notes and pull it into answers to these 3 questions. Who are your users? What is the primary goal of the dashboard? And what does the dashboard absolutely have to do? These are the non-negotiables. For the rest of the slides here, I'm going to be abbreviating these questions as who, goal, and requirements. Sometimes the answers to these questions will be pretty obvious. For example, the user of the dashboard I'm building for John Massey is just John. But for more complicated dashboards with multiple users, pulling all these notes into a set of goals and requirements isn't as straightforward. I think about this part of the process as looking for insights. Just like the dashboards we're creating for our users help give them insights, the conversations we've had with our users will give us insights. There are two data-driven strategies I like to use in order to organize my notes and pull out these insights. First, I like to use something called affinity mapping. This is a great method because it can help you group and synthesize your findings visually. It helps you understand which areas were mentioned more and less in your conversations as well. When using this technique, the first thing I do is take all of my insights and write them down on sticky notes or note cards. If I've interviewed multiple people, sometimes I like to use a different color for each of my users so that when they're clustered later, I can see how many different users brought up a particular topic. Once everything is written out, the mapping process begins. Start with a single sticky note and put it on the board. Pick up a second and ask, is this similar to the first or not? You continue this process until you have all the sticky notes on the board and in groups. My groupings usually evolve as I'm working on the mapping, so if yours do too, that's fine. You're not doing it wrong. Here's an example of a completed affinity map. This one shows the conversation topics from my conversation with John Massey. You can see I ended up with about 5 large groups, and for this one, I decided to color code the notes based on the type of information I had. So some of them show some little charts, and the orange and purple show problems or ideas that John had. Once I had this map, I was able to look at all of the categories and pull out insights from each one, which I then translated into my requirements. Here are the answers to the questions I asked at the beginning of the distill section. You'll notice as well that I included another answer, non-goals. Non-goals aren't something that I always write down, but sometimes when I'm looking at all the information I've gathered, I realize that there are a few things I should explicitly decide not to do in order to prevent myself from trying to do too much all at once. In this particular case, John and I had talked about tracking individual employee trends to understand which training opportunities were available for them. But it was less important than everything else the dashboard needed to do, so I decided to explicitly exclude it. You'll also notice that most of these requirements don't actually say how I'm going to accomplish them, and that's intentional. During this phase, we're trying to focus on what the dashboard needs to do rather than how we're going to do it. My only exception to the rule is this: decide what type of dashboard this will be up front. And I like to think about dashboards on a spectrum. On one side, we have an incredibly interactive application, so more of like a dashboard as an app. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have more of an article with information that is augmented by the data. Because the type of dashboard you're building here is going to have a huge effect on how you present the information and the amount of interactivity you're going to add to the dashboard, this is something that I do like to decide up front. Moving on, the second technique I use to find insights is called pattern identification, which is another visual methodology that's useful when you've interviewed 2 or more people. And I'm going to walk you through another example here. This one involves the Tableau e-learning program, which you may have heard of. If you haven't, though, it's a program that lets anyone take a targeted Tableau class online rather than needing to schedule a more intensive and time-consuming in-person session. At Tableau, we wanted to make sure that while we were offering this new program, we were reaching more customers, we were not losing our overall training revenue. Our executives asked for a dashboard to help keep a pulse on this new program and how it was going. So just for context, here's the dashboard that we ended up giving to our executives. I'm going to walk you through how we went from notes to goals for this one. First, we interviewed 3 executives, Andre, Gina, and Charles. We asked them a couple questions about how they use their dashboards and how they interact in general with their data today, as well as asking about how this might fit into their current workflow. As we took notes for each user, we started to create a set of scales. And I'm showing 8 different scales right here, but don't stress about exactly what scales to use or how many to create. I usually end up with 20 to 30, and these scales are a tool to help give me interesting insights. So I usually like to have a couple that are related to how they use technology in general, and a couple that are about how they use dashboards in general. And then as I interview people, I'll notice interesting things and just add a new scale. After each interview, we looked at the notes and mapped out where we thought each person fell on each of the scales. So this is where Andre fell on each of these scales. The important thing here is relationship to other users, not exactly where they end up on the scale. After interviewing Gina and Charles, here's what we ended up with. So we can actually start to see some trends here. First, our users didn't quite stay as up to date with their data as they wanted to, and that's something that we might be able to help with. When looking at the technology section here, we noticed that email and phone usage were pretty high compared to desktop usage. And finally, we saw here that the desire to really dig into the data set was fairly low. These users were looking for updates more than anything else. Here are the 3 insights that we pulled out of the data set. The next thing we did was take those insights and translate them into requirements. So the first 2 up here became a single requirement: get insights without disrupting the existing flow. Our thought was that if we created something that better fit into the current flow, it would encourage our executives to stay more up to date. The second was that we're going to use this article style of dashboard, since the users are really just looking for updates. Here's that final dashboard again. And there were also 2 more goals that came out of our notes. On the bottom, you'll see communicate big wins and understand the impact of e-learning on revenue. In order to address the requirements here, we did a couple things. First, this dashboard is formatted for email and mobile. So you can see that this is a long, skinny dashboard. It actually scrolls down off the screen. And that made it easy for executives to get this information in email. We also put that more important information on top so they could see it immediately on a small screen and have it top of mind throughout the day. As we scroll to the bottom, you can see that understanding the impact of e-learning on revenue is down here in this revenue chart. Those dark green lines are showing our in-person revenue, and the light green is showing our e-learning revenue. So our executives can see that even though we aren't seeing as many in-person bookings, we are actually reaching more customers without losing revenue. It's a win-win. I have one final takeaway before we move to the next phase, and that is to remember that you might have multiple user types. So you may need to think about how you're going to address users with different needs. There are a few things that you can do when you find out that your users have different needs or behave in different ways. If you're able to, I would recommend building multiple dashboards that are tailored to each different user type. That's not always the case, though. It's not something you're always going to be able to do. Other options are to decide which user is more important and prioritize that user a little bit more than the others when you build the dashboard, maybe putting some of their information on top or more prominently on the dashboard. And another option is to use interactivity to show more in-depth data when your users ask for it. Taking a step back for a moment, we've gone through the first half of this process, and by now we should feel pretty confident about the problems we're solving as we move on to the ideation phase. Now, this is probably the part of the process that you're already pretty comfortable with because you're doing it in some form already. During this phase, the goal is to come up with a couple different ways that you can address each of the requirements from the distill phase. If you have multiple users, it's also good to come up with what you'd consider the best solution for each user type. Tableau is a great tool to use to ideate, but some of your requirements aren't going to be data viz related, and sometimes you don't have the data when you're trying to come up with this design originally. So here's an example of an early draft of the dashboard that we created to help those executives keep tabs on the e-learning program. And the first 2 requirements were actually really simple to come up with solutions for. For the first one, we decided pretty quickly to format it for mobile and email. And the article style is itself a solution. But the final 2, those ones are a bit broader. And there are a lot of different ways to address them. I'm going to talk about 2 different ideation techniques to help you broaden your thinking and come up with more creative solutions when addressing these requirements. Before I get into those, I want to remind you that it's incredibly important during this phase to defer judgment of your own ideas or of anyone else's. Build on your crazy ideas instead of shutting them down. The first technique is called Crazy Eights. What you're going to do here is come up with 8 ideas in 5 minutes. Typically, on the design team at least, we actually do fold up papers like this one and draw an idea on each section of it. This might seem like it's a silly exercise, but there's a really good reason it works. Our brains naturally start filtering ourselves as soon as we come up with any new ideas. We don't feel like the idea is good enough, or we aren't sure if it makes the cut to put on paper. If you only have 5 minutes, every single idea you have makes the cut. The point is to encourage yourself to get everything you're thinking of out there on paper and go through it later. Usually the first 2 ideas are pretty easy, and then you kind of start pushing yourself, and you'll be surprised at what you come up with. The next ideation technique is called blue sky thinking, and this one's a little bit more structured than Crazy 8's. What you do here is you start with a ground idea for each of your requirements. And a ground idea is probably the more mundane idea that you have that you came up with, probably the first one. And so you just write those down for each requirement. The next thing you do is come up with a blue sky idea. And what that is supposed to be is if you had a magic wand, how would you solve this user's problem? You can do anything at all. Mind control, you can have fairies come out of the sky, really whatever you want. Now, once we have both of these ideas for each of our requirements, we're going to combine them into what's normally called a mountain idea. And that's supposed to be a more creative solution than your ground idea, but still something that's realistic, not totally a blue sky idea. This technique pushes you a little bit further than where you were likely to go brainstorming if you just stuck to the real world. Once you have a couple solutions, it's good to spend some time connecting the dots, going over everything you've come up with and considering how all of these things are going to work together in your dashboard, and start prototyping and mapping out what your dashboard is going to look like. One of my favorite ways to keep myself creative during this part of the process is to look at other dashboards that I love the design of. For example, I bookmarked this one because it does a great job of telling a story about a single event. It also has great use of color. If you look, there's really only one color used in this entire dashboard besides black and white, and it's still interesting enough to keep your users' attention. The layout here is also excellent. I love how the user used the shape of the coastline to create some white space in the dashboard, and this isn't something I would have come up with on my own. Whether you're already in the habit of bookmarking awesome dashboards or not, I want to give a shout out to the Big Book of Dashboards. This book is seriously like a recipe book for your dashboards, and there are so many examples in it that one of them is bound to be similar to a scenario that you're working on. It's a really great book to keep on your desk if you're someone who creates dashboards often. Once we have a couple ideas to address each of our requirements, we're going to move on to the validation phase. During this phase, we're going to take the ideas that we think we want to move forward with and start figuring out what works and what doesn't. Here, it's good to try to fix everything you can before you start sending things out for feedback from your users. I use a 4-step process to validate my designs. The first step is to check the basics. And the basics are really just best practices that almost every dashboard should make sure that they do. So here's a list of some of the basics that I like to make sure I keep in mind. And I'll sit here for a little while so you can take a screenshot of it if you'd like. But on the interaction side, it's important to make sure to keep interaction effects on screen if possible. So if you're going to have your user click on something, something else is going to filter or change, try to make sure that whatever is changing is going to stay on screen so that things aren't changing out from underneath your users. Additionally, don't make users scroll within vizzes if at all possible. It's better to have fewer vizzes that do one thing really well than to have a ton of vizzes that your users have to scroll to find what they need in. The only exception to this is maybe a top N chart where most of your users really only need to see the top 5 or 10 things, and some of your users will want to scroll. Lastly, be mindful of users' familiarity with Tableau here. If some of your users have used Tableau a lot, it's more okay to use things like drop-down parameters and know that they really know what's happening there. If your users aren't that familiar with Tableau, it's better to include some text in your dashboard that coaches them a little bit as to how to use it. On the visual side, one really important piece is to get your dashboard right in black and white first. And this is great because Tableau really tries to give you colors. And they're great color palettes, but it's not wonderful to have a ton of colors in your dashboard most of the time. If you get it right in black and white, that will, 1, make sure you're not using too many colors, and 2, it will usually make sure that your dashboard works for anyone who has a visual impairment or is colorblind. And this also then helps you with the next goal, which is color draws attention. So use color mindfully and consistently, which means, one, you only use color if you know you need it, and two, if you're using, for example, blue for one thing, make sure that the same thing is blue through the whole dashboard, because that way the color is attached to a specific meaning. Lastly, white space helps your users focus, and you probably need more of it than you think you do. So just one more thing to keep in mind there. Once we've verified that we're following all these best practices, my next strategy is to be a detective. And when I'm doing this, I like to reflect on one episode of Brooklyn Nine-Nine. If you haven't seen this, it's a series on, I'm not sure if it's on Netflix or Hulu actually, but it's a series about a group of detectives. And during this episode, one of the main characters' girlfriends goes missing. And he walks through New York literally pretending he is her. In this particular scene, he's physically acting like he's having a cigarette because he noticed that she would have stopped on this corner to have a cigarette. When you're trying to pare down all of your ideas to the ones that you should move forward with, physically going through your dashboard in your user's shoes is going to help you understand which of your ideas are more promising and where some of your ideas can be improved. The next step is to look for lightweight feedback. Here, we're looking for easy fixes to the dashboards that our users may notice right away. I usually look for this type of feedback via email or just quick 5 to 10 minute conversations showing my users what I've made. One great strategy to use when asking for feedback is to pretend a colleague of yours built the dashboard. If someone thinks that you're asking for feedback on something that you didn't personally create, they'll be a lot more honest with you about its flaws. Whereas if they know you made it, they're more likely to tell you that it's pretty good. When we were working on the e-learning dashboard for our executives, we sent them this draft over email. And this was not even a real dashboard yet. It's just a prototype. We had a few questions for them, but in general, we left it open-ended. And one person emailed us back with this question: how much of our total training revenue has transferred to e-learning? This is the viz that we had originally created to answer that question. And we could have answered them and given them detailed instructions on how to read the viz, but the real problem here is that we created a viz that one of our users didn't understand. After a little bit of back and forth to get at what the person was really looking for here, we ended up creating this new visualization, which showed the e-learning revenue in comparison to our existing revenue streams more clearly for them. Finally, the last step here is to re-interview your users. If you are really lucky, you'll have this opportunity. I honestly usually don't, but if you do, you should take advantage of it. When you're doing your user interview, make sure that you leave things open-ended. So you'll be tempted to tell your users what the dashboard is supposed to do, give them a tour, walk them through it. Don't do any of that. You want to see them use your dashboard as they would use it normally, which is without you sitting next to them. A great way to do this is to give your user a series of tasks to do. Make sure that these tasks align with your user's needs and those requirements that you came up with during the distill phase of your dashboards. At the end of this interview, you'll also want to ask if the tasks were things your users would actually do, and leave room for them to show you other tasks you might have missed. Now, while they're doing these tasks, it's also important to ask your users to think aloud while they're using this dashboard. Normally, people don't talk to their computers while they're using them, so this is something that you'll probably have to keep reminding your users to do throughout the interview. Especially if you see them pause or look confused, if they click on something and then go back, just ask, what are you thinking about right now? Or what did you expect to happen there that didn't? With all of this, you might be wondering, when are you finished? It's really easy to keep iterating and continue improving and adding to your dashboard forever, but perfect is the enemy of done. I usually consider myself finished when my users can complete those mainline tasks I've outlined without any help. And it's okay if they struggle a little bit but eventually figure it out, because that means they'll be able to figure things out on their own. Okay, let's recap. We've gone through this design process: discover, distill, ideate, validate. And I want to touch on one more way to think about this process. This is called the double diamond. The reason it's displayed like this is because the diamond represents how many ideas you have and what type of thinking you're doing along the way. When we're in the discover phase, we're broadening our perspective. We're asking questions, figuring out new things we didn't know before. During the distill phase, we're going to pull back, develop a perspective, and come up with a couple of goals. And that's what the joining of the two diamonds is. That's us figuring out what direction we're going with this dashboard. We move on to ideate, and we're going to brainstorm, come up with a lot of ways to give our users what they might need, broadening again. And finally, for validate, we pull back, looking for flaws and settling on that final dashboard. Here are all of the techniques I've gone through today. I'm not going to read them all, but if you'd like, feel free to take a screenshot. And one last thing is that this design process is iterative. It's really more of a guideline, and it's not something that you have to follow to a T. It's not something that you have to spend hours and hours on to make sure you get right. Any single piece of this can be valuable in your design process. So use what makes sense to you and throw out what doesn't. You don't have to do this in order either. You might brainstorm and then realize there were some questions you didn't ask your user and go back and ask them. That's completely fine. I'm going to leave you with a final thought. Good design is knowing your trade-offs. Every design has a trade-off, and those trade-offs are easier to make if you understand your users' needs and what they'll be able to tolerate and what they won't. If you want more UX, here are some great resources that I love. The interactiondesign.org in particular has a ton of great online resources. With that, I'm going to hand it back to Bill to manage the questions.
Well, Alyshia, thank you for that excellent presentation. And while we get started with today's Q&A session, I want to thank the audience for their participation. Had a lot of questions that have come in, and we'll do our best to get through all of them in the time remaining. And so during this Q&A session, I'll leave up this screen with contact information for Alyshia if you'd like to contact her following today's event. So let's get started. Alyshia, the lead question. When you are developing these dashboards, are you prototyping directly in Tableau, or are there other tools or templates that you're using first?
Yeah, so sometimes I will prototype in Tableau. Usually if I already have the data, I'm using Tableau and other tools in tandem. I'll usually play with something in Tableau, and then I will go back into either PowerPoint, which is honestly a great tool for layout, or I use something called Sketch. That's what we use on the design team, and it's kind of like PowerPoint, but it's a bit more flexible. That tool only costs $99 a year, and honestly, it's wonderful. So I'll use that to play around with layout and just move things around a little quicker than you can do in Tableau.
Oh, well, thanks. Thanks for that clarification. You know, one of our audience members asks about a particular technique. You talked about a number of techniques. This member is asking, do you ever use a technique called design sprints?
Yeah, I do. I'm actually setting one up that's going to happen right after the Tableau Conference with my team. The design team as a whole has been working on design sprints. This is something that we tend to do when we have a lot of different moving pieces that kind of span a number of teams. So we'll do that to get a larger number of designers on the design team and our PMs and developers together. Right now, the design sprints usually help us broaden our perspective more than come to one specific solution. When you have 10 people in the room, it's hard to come to a consensus. But yeah, we use this here.
Oh, terrific. Oh, good to know. Now, one of our audience members asks, their customers seem to just want tables, even though they know that other solutions might be better for them. How can you go about bridging that gap between visualizations and tables?
Yeah, I've definitely heard that one before. So one way is to really try to figure out why your users want tables. Sometimes it's a comfort thing, and sometimes it's because they really need to understand specific data that is in the table. So there's a couple ways you can do that. One great way I like to kind of help bridge the gap is by using Viz in Tooltip. So you can put a table on hover so that a user can see, they can actually see the viz when they hover on a specific point. Sometimes that's not going to work because the user needs to see more information at once. So another way to start kind of weaning people off tables is to show visualizations next to tables and have the visualizations and the tables kind of filter each other. And then the table can start taking less and less space in the viz gradually.
Oh, terrific. Okay, thank you. Now, during this design process that we talked about earlier, an audience member is asking, should you wait until you are fully done with a prototype, or can you do this iteratively with the user? In other words, give them a draft and then do a little more improvement and so forth?
Yeah, if you have access to your users and they don't mind giving you feedback more than a couple times, doing this iteratively is wonderful. I would slightly caution against having the same user every time, because that user is going to start, they'll just kind of know what you were trying to do, and so they'll be able to use the dashboard probably better than a new user. That said, if you're building this specifically for one person, then yeah, keep working with one person on it.
Okay, and I guess that leads to another question, and that is, well, how do you do this if you don't have access to users to begin with?
Yeah, that's a really difficult one. I would kind of I would turn it back a little bit. I'm kind of curious, like, what's the barrier that is keeping you from being able to talk to your users at all? And really try to break that down, because that is really important. If you don't have access to them, the best thing you can do is sometimes what I will do is I'll talk to my colleagues, or I'll have someone else pretend to be a user and walk through my dashboard and my ideas with me with a very critical eye. And I'll also use that be a detective technique where I try to walk through things as someone else. But yeah, it's hard, but sometimes it's reality.
Right, yep. So here's an interesting question from the audience, and they're introducing the idea of what it takes to be an efficient dashboard. That is, how do you go about designing a dashboard that has the appropriate information and allows the users to complete their final tasks, but allows them to do it actually better than they could do it before? Better than they could do it before.
Okay. I might want to think about this one a little bit to make sure I understand the question. Is that user able to clarify the question a little bit?
Well, I don't know that we'll have the direct feedback,
but
okay. I gather that the information is, it may be that the design process that you described already delivers the most efficient dashboard. But do you ever think about
it doesn't necessarily deliver the most efficient dashboard, but it should help. Especially if you're prioritizing what those requirements are that you have for your dashboard. One thing you can do is you can go back and verify with your user, if you can talk to them, that those are actually things that they would want to do with the dashboard. There's also one thing that I like to go back to, which is there's this concept of a local maxima. And if you already have a dashboard and you're trying to make it better, you can use this design process to get to that local maximum, right? But the brainstorming ideation process will sometimes help you get to a different, better maximum that's a completely different design. So in that case, I would just try to come up with stuff like break what you already have, try something completely different, and test both of them side by side and see if you come up with something better. You can usually do this as well by really going back to those notes and all the things that you know about your user in order to try and inspire yourself to come up with something that will work better for them.
Alyshia, thank you for that answer. You know, the design processes that you laid out, they all looked like they were frankly a lot of fun. One of our audience members is asking, what do you think is the biggest challenge in designing a dashboard?
I think the biggest challenge is that there are so many right ways to do it. It's easier to say, okay, I'm going to follow all these best practices and make a great dashboard. But depending on who your user is, there's still going to be maybe 5 amazing dashboards that you could make them. And my biggest challenge is paring down and deciding what I want that dashboard to focus on, because I usually want to make it do everything.
Right. Okay. You know, here's an interesting question. You spend your entire working life focused on this, but a lot of people don't. So there is a question from an audience member that says that she's the manager of a team that creates dashboards as a secondary responsibility and would like to know what training you recommend for them to learn this approach holistically, and is there a credential that they could hire for?
Interesting. There are people who do user experience design consulting who will come in and teach teams in maybe like a day workshop some of these techniques and have people actually go through them, which is really useful. I know that the interaction design, let me pull up that slide again. Interaction Design Foundation has a ton of great resources. I honestly go back to this so often in my daily life at work, just to remind myself when I'm in a different part of the process. Since at Tableau, when we're building the entire product, going through this entire process can sometimes take a year from getting something to concept all the way to we have something and we know what we're building and we're working on validating it. So going back to this helps me ground myself and remind myself what the different parts of the process are. Additionally, Stanford has great resources on the Stanford Design School. If you search for that online, I think it's called D-School. You'll be able to find some things there as well.
Oh, well, thanks. And while we're on this issue of resources, there's an audience member that has asked if there are any upcoming conferences with Tableau where they could get into this in more depth.
Well, there's the Tableau Conference. It's in New Orleans. It is next week. You should go if you can get your work to send you. It's an amazing conference, and I will be giving this talk again. In addition to me giving this talk, there is a whole slew of dashboard design talks which get into more detail about exact dashboard best practices. I went to a talk last year, which I think is being given again, that talked a little bit about how you could have the same data set in very similar vizzes and tell completely different stories with them. So that was really interesting. In addition to that, if you cannot go to the conference, all of the talks will be available online afterwards, which I'm not sure what the website will be yet, but probably I would say mid-November. So probably after Thanksgiving, you might want to go search online for Tableau Conference 2018. And you can just browse through every single talk at the conference.
Oh, thanks. Thanks. That's very helpful. Now, in terms of best practices, I know that that's such a broad topic, but the audience is interested to know about your editing process. I guess this question starts with, well, how do you know when there are too many charts on the dashboard? How do you know when it's time to reduce clutter?
I know when it's time to reduce clutter by my first thing is I am really, really a stickler about those scroll bars. So I will try to make sure that none of my visits scroll. Now, if I think I need all of those visualizations, I'll try to really make them just show the top couple things, or I will make sure that they're filtered enough so that they don't need to scroll. But yeah, so the scroll bars, and then I think a lot of it is I'll go through other dashboards that I've bookmarked, dashboards I like, and then compare my own dashboard to dashboards I already know have worked well. And if mine looks like too much compared to that one, it's a fuzzy process. It's a feel it out type thing. But that's when I'm like, okay, well, maybe I should do something here. What really needs to stay?
Okay, that makes perfect sense. On this issue of what's possible and what can be done, it would be interesting to hear how often you run into circumstances where the data that you need to answer the customer's problem just isn't available. What do? Do you just put everything on hold until you can find the data, or is there some way to work around that?
Yeah, so I was actually going through this with my dad as well. He's actually since he's this talk has been created, he's started a startup which deals with diagnostics for vehicles, and it's really interesting. And he was trying to use Tableau for it, and his IT managers were not keen on sending their data to their boss's daughter. So what I did instead was I asked him if they could at least send me the data structure, and I took that and I made some dummy data for myself in Excel, just using Excel random number generators, and I ended up making a dummy version of a viz, which they could then recreate in Tableau for themselves.
Oh, okay. All right. Good solution. You know, one of the things that's going on in our profession is, you know, you spend your entire professional life focusing on developing good dashboards with great user experience, and yet at the same time, the market as a whole and Tableau in general is encouraging a lot of people to build their own dashboards. What do you see as this conflict between user self-service folks that want to build their own versus getting good UX advice in building them? Is the self-service growing faster? Are people trying to build their own more often, or should they be stopping and seeking out advice of a professional UX expert?
I mean, I think it's fine if people know how to use Tableau and they want to build their own dashboards for themselves. I would say go for it. But just keep in mind that when you're building your own dashboard, it's still important to think about how you can solve your own problems creatively, because I've seen, and I do this myself too, where I'll give myself something that will, it's more of a Band-Aid than a solution. So I'll add something just to get the data I need right now, and I end up with these workbooks that have way too many tabs, a ton of stuff in it, and I'll realize, you know, a month later I've been wasting all this time because now I've created this behemoth of a Tableau workbook for myself, where I could have, you know, taken an hour, thought more creatively about how I wanted to actually solve my problem and what my problem was, and made something that saved me time. So if you are your own user, that's fine. Just treat yourself with the same care and kindness that you would treat someone else.
Great advice. Great advice. Well, Alyshia, thank you for some great answers to some very good questions. And for those of you that asked questions today that weren't answered, we'll be sending all the unanswered questions to Alyshia and the Tableau team so they can follow up with you after today's webinar. Now, I have just a few quick announcements. If you'd please mark your calendar for October 30th, and that's our next DSC webinar, which is How to Structure a Modern Data Ops Team. Also remember that today's taping will be available for on-demand viewing later today, and you can find that on the home page of Data Science Central in the Webinar tab located at the top of the page. Well, this brings today's webinar to a close. I'd like to thank our audience for their attendance and thoughtful questions. A special thanks again to Tableau for their sponsorship, and particularly for our speaker today, Alyshia Olsen, for insight into today's topic. This is Bill Vorhies. I'm very pleased to have been your host for today's event. I look forward to seeing you all again on October 30. Have a great day.